Okay, let's move on to the next slide, which is slide 17. And in this slide, we are looking at the reasons why Buddhism became a pan Asian cultural phenomenon across Asia, right? So here I'm showing this map on your right hand side of your corner of your screen, and in which I am we look at how Buddhism originated in India, Nepal area. Buddha was born in Nepal, and he lived much of his life in different parts of northern India, UP, Bihar, for example. Then we see the first arrow going up is from that northern part up further into north of India, and from there it goes to via the Silk Route. It goes into China, right? And from China it comes to Tibet. From China it goes to Korea. From China it goes to Japan, and so on. That's the orange part of the map. Then we see another arrow going down below from Bodh Gaya from India to Sri Lanka. From Sri Lanka, it goes to Burma, right? From Burma, it goes to Thailand. From there, it goes to back into China, another branch of Buddhism that goes from Laos to China. That's the brown part. Brown part is the Theravada portion of Buddhism. Orange part is the Mahayana portion part of the Buddhism. So that's how Buddhism spreads across Asia from India to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Sri Lanka, and so on. Why? Why does Buddhism spreads unlike Hinduism or especially unlike Jainism? Right? What were the reasons? Number one reason that I found in my research is the very innovative use of Sangha, the monastic community that Buddha organized. It is the first organized movement in the world that very systematically was designed by the Buddha himself to spread his teaching. Buddha said after every sermon, after every discourse, preach my doctrine, spread my word, spread it far and wide. Of course, he did use the words in English. He used probably some form of the local languages, local dialects of the language, Pali or even Prakrit. So whatever language he was speaking, in that he was giving these discourses and was telling his disciples to spread the word. So very innovative use of Sangha. Second reason for the spread of Buddhism is Buddha's preference for the middle way. It appealed to both the intellectuals as well as to the lay people. It had the psychological approaches, meditation, and so on that appealed to the intellectuals. It also had a very simpler message of not. It was not dependent on any high caste rituals or so on that were being controlled by Brahmins. So it was appealing for both intellectual, the so-called upper classes, and the lay people, so-called lower classes. So that became another reason for its pan-Asian spread across Asia. Number three, the third reason for Buddhism's spread across Asia, it's very simplified ethical message. It's focused on compassion and morality. That of course appeal to everybody. Be truthful, be kind, be gentle, and so on. So that was another reason for its spread. Then we see the fourth reason is the acceptance of local traditions. It was Buddha's teachings were based and it in the local languages. He used the language of the land. He utilized the existing symbols, and as Buddhism spreads across India, beyond India, it utilizes the symbols and rituals. For example, in Tibet, China, Japan, it's not against the local tradition. It accepts the local traditions. It merges with the local tradition. That really happened in China as Buddhism spreads across China and Japan. The fifth and the last reason for Buddhism spread across Asia is India's reputation at that time. India was regarded as a destination for higher learning, for psychological learning, for spiritual learning, for cultural teachings and so on. So India was almost like a spiritual, cultural, religious superpower at that time. So anything that comes from India was highly regarded. People used to walk for thousands of miles all the way from China and will go into India and sit with the great teachers, great masters, great gurus, and learn different languages of India and learn the psychology, philosophy of Buddhism, and so on. And they used to take these texts, they used to translate these texts into Chinese language, for example. Fayan and Wensang, for example, did all those things almost 2000 years ago. So these are the five reasons for Buddhism spread across Asia. First is again the innovative use of the monastic community, the middle way, the ethical message, acceptance of the local traditions, and India's reputation. Now we see on next slide, slide 18, the reasons for decline in India. Why Buddhism pretty much disappeared from India after 500 to 800 years after Buddha's death. Buddhism seems to have pretty much disappeared. Why did that happen? So there were some internal factors for that. Buddhism, apparently the Sangha, the monastic communities had some issues such as moral degeneration of the monastic communities, schism and sectarian disputes within the monastic communities. The intellectual base started becoming weak and weak. The intellectual innovations that were happening in the first 1,000 years of Buddhism's history, they stop happening. The innovations stop happening after 800 or 1,000 years after Buddha's death. So Buddhism lost its vigor, its rigor. Buddhism also was very less earthbound to Indian cultural practices. Buddhism was very, and still is very, very trans-local kind of phenomenon. It's very easy for Buddhism to, move away from one place and move to a totally different place, and it's fine. It can easily survive and flourish in a foreign location. Kind of like what happened to Judaism and Christianity. Judaism was very closely tied with the Hebrew culture of Jewish people, but Christianity became a transnational phenomenon. Something similar can be said about Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism is very Indian cultural specific phenomenon, whereas Buddhism is a pan or transnational phenomenon. That's another reason for Buddhism's easy spread outside India. But when it declined in India, nobody cared enough to keep it very tied to Indian cultural practices, because Buddhism was meant as a transnational phenomenon in the beginning itself. Other reasons for Buddhism's decline within India can be attributed to external factors. For example, Buddhism lost its political support, especially after Ashoka. Ashoka was the first major supporter of Buddhism that embraced Buddhism after he has his change of heart, after he ends up killing millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people in the Kalinga War. And then he has this change of heart and he accepts the non-violence as preached by Buddhism. But that great political support that Buddhism received from Ashoka, it waned down. It became very less after Ashoka's death. Second external factor for Buddhism's decline on your slide 19 is the revival of Hinduism by great figures such as Shankara, who literally walked across India and defeated several Buddhist scholars across India. And whoever was defeated in these debates, they became disciples of Shankara and they adopted Hinduism again. So they came back to Hinduism from Buddhism. So that became kind of a great revival movement as led by Shankara in 8th century, and that became another reason for Buddhism's decline and resurgence of Hinduism. Buddhism also was included within Hinduism by later figures. So Buddha was incorporated as the 9th incarnation of Vishnu. Philosophies of Buddhism were also incorporated into Hinduism. Buddha images were replaced by Shiva images that looked very similar. And then finally, Islamic invasions that led to destruction of great universities and monasteries in Nalanda and other places across North India. So those were huge, gigantic centers of Buddhism's wisdom, Buddhism's philosophy, Buddhism's practices. They were all those great centers, when they were destroyed, burnt in some cases by the invaders. That became another reason for Buddhism's decline in India. As it declined, however, it influenced Indian culture forever. Buddhism revived the traditions of non-violence and vegetarianism in India, for example, in addition to Jainism's efforts. Buddhism also gave very less importance to caste system. It simplified the rituals, and it was one of the first traditions of India where women were made nuns, so women could also achieve their social liberty. Then the last slide we have is on Tibetan Buddhism, which was founded in 8th century by Padmasambhava. He had hidden the Buddhist writings and artifacts for future discovery at auspicious times. The rituals, the initiations, the symbolism were all in combination with the local Bon practices. Tulku is the Dalai Lama that is reincarnated from previous deceased spiritual masters, and he heads one of the 4 other sects. So that completes our lecture on Buddhism, and we'll continue with more religions in the next one.